everyone. In this video I'm going to walk you through the process of upgrading the Ridgid R4330 planer with a new helical cutter head from Byrd Tools. There are a bunch of tools needed for this. Most important is a really good set of Allen wrenches. I'll link to all of them in the notes below the video. Alright, before we get started tearing this thing apart, I want to do a couple of things. First of all, we're going to do a quick sound check. This is using the NIOSH app on my iPhone, just to kind of get a before and after, because one of the things that the helical head is supposed to do is reduce the noise a little bit. So we're going to run a couple of ash boards through and measure the sound, and then compare it at the end. That first measurement there that you saw, about 80 decibels, that's just the dust collector itself, the shop vac that's attached to the planer. So I want to make sure I isolate that noise first, and then get the overall the max decibels for running these two ash boards through. And then I'm going to use the same two ash boards and run them through again after I do the cutter head replacement. So 113 is the decibels at the starting point here. These are the shavings, really more chips that are produced by the straight knives in the original cutter head. We'll see if we can do a comparison at the end. Alright, the first thing that we're going to do, of course, is remove the, I'll make sure it's unplugged, and then remove the dust hood assembly, upper and lower dust hood on the R4330. Just two little knobs that hold that in. Take those out, remove the dust hood, and that will give you access to the straight knives. And then we're going to want to remove all three of the straight knives before you get started with any of this. Of course, the first thing you're going to do anytime you're doing maintenance on a machine like this is clean the thing up so that you're not throwing sawdust and grime everywhere. So there's a little toolkit that I have learned in this process is essentially useless. The little Allen wrench there is okay, but there's a little magnet that I'm going to try to use in a minute here, and it's just not worth whatever it cost Ridgid to make and include that thing. But you know, you got to use the Allen wrench. Get your all of the little screws that hold the cutter head or the straight knives in place. Loosen all of those, and then once you get those loose, you'll pull out the magnet, or in my case, I'm going to go get a different tool and use that to pull the blades out of the cutter head. You definitely want to have the blades removed before you start this process, or you will assuredly slice up your hands, which is why I use the cut-proof gloves anytime I'm working, especially with the straight knives. They're also handy when you're working with the carbide inserts on the Shelix head, but I found that I've cut my hand several times on straight knives from various planers, so I always use the cut-proof gloves when I'm working with them now. This is that stupid magnet thing that Ridgid provides. This is my first time taking these knives out of this planer, by the way. I just bought it used, and determined very quickly that what I want is the tool that comes with the old TP1300, which has a magnet end and then a little hook end that's really great for grabbing the end of the knives, and then you pull out the straight knives, rotate the head around, pull out the other two straight knives, and then you've got that part of the process done. One quick note, you're going to want to remove this little plastic index thingy here early in the process because it's very fragile and it will surely break if you don't remove it. Now, before we start the teardown, I do want to take just a minute to address the weirdness that is the R4330 planer. I think Ridgid must have developed this during what I would call their experimental phase. You know, that time like when you're in college and you engage in some high-risk behaviors that you wouldn't normally. There's just some weird stuff like this bicycle chain on the bottom, and then some other things that you'll see as we go through. All right, the first thing we're going to do is take off the plastic top. The top and the sides of this planer are just plastic screwed and bolted to a pretty substantial skeletal frame inside. It reminds me of a roll cage, like you're going to take the planer off-roading or something. But the top is held on with 4 sheet metal screws that connect the top to the sides, and then in addition to those sheet metal screws across each of the 4 corners, you've got also some some hex screws. That's what the sheet metal screw looks like, and then some I think it's 3mm hex socket screws on the top. Everything on this planer is metric, by the way. So you take out those 4 corner screws, 4 inside and 4 on top, and then you can take off the top. All right, next we're going to remove the sides, and the sides again are held on with 4 Phillips head sheet metal screws on each side. It's kind of tricky because there's 2 in the top and 2 in the middle going through the angle corners. So easy enough to remove these screws, but you'll see that I've got the carriage about in the middle, and it's actually covering the middle screws that hold the plastic sides on. I wasn't aware that those middle screws were there until I got started. This is what they look like, just a simple little sheet metal screw, Phillips head. And by the way, this is also a really good time to have a magnetized screwdriver, because those dang little screws are going to fall while you're trying to get them out. Pretty easy to drop them. So I moved, as you can see, I moved the carriage up to the very top of the planer here to get to the middle set of screws. That worked fine. I think, in retrospect, I think you can actually move it straight down to the bottom and then get out all 4 screws on each side. I don't know. This is the way I did it. It worked. However, you can get access to those screws. Just remember there's 4 on each one of those side plastic panels, 2 at the top, 2 in the middle. All right, so once you get all 4 of the screws out, it's a simple thing. The plastic side is just sitting in a little track on the base of the planer, and it'll just lift away just like that.
Before you can take off the other side piece, of course, I've already popped off the knob for the repeated cut. It's down here, simply pulls off. Then you have to just take out the 1 screw in the middle of the height adjustment knob. I would recommend take it back down to about the midpoint first. Then this is a 4mm screw, I think, although I wasn't able to find any specs for it. 5/32 seems to fit equally well, so either a 4mm or 5/32. Hex bolt. Remove that, and this will just pop right off. Once you have that removed, the other side piece comes off.
Make sure you pay attention to the little ball bearing that's held in place with a spring at the bottom of the repeated cut block there. Once the plastic side is removed, that repeated cut block is kind of loose, and you could lose this ball bearing. So keep an eye on that and make sure you don't lose it.
These hex screws that hold the top frame on were in pretty tight. So I found they're 3mm, but my regular 3mm hex wrench was just stripping the end when I tried to use it to loosen them. So I found that this type of wrench is a lot stronger, and you can get some leverage on it and really get these tighter screws loosened this way. So I recommend this for this type of work. Yeah, these are torqued and they're pretty tight.
Again, I'll take a moment here to comment on the absurdity of the design of this particular planer. Note that there are 4 of these little hex screws at each corner, certainly overkill. And the other overkill thing here, and really throughout this whole machine, is how tightly torqued these all are, and they're all locked in with thread lock. So keep that in mind as you're getting started on this.
Okay. And these just sit down on top of the elevation screws at all four corners. In fact, just to make sure I get it in the right way, I'm going to go ahead and label the front of this to match the front, just to make sure that it goes in right next time. Alright, so I've got front labeled with tape there, and this should just be able to stay together in assembly. Just set it off to the side. Alright, now you're going to want to put the height adjustment knob back on and hold that still, because otherwise when you go to turn this, it's just going to turn the whole knob, turn the whole rod. You can use the height adjustment knob to hold the rod still, and then take off this hex bolt on the top of this rod. And then once you've got...
All right, what you're looking at here is the vertical rod that goes right in front of that pulley is called the transmission shaft. That's what we just took the screw and cap off of the top of, and it connects down under the base to that bicycle chain that we looked at earlier. We've got to get that out of the way in order to get that pulley off. That pulley is on the end of the cutter head, and so we have to figure out how to remove that that transmission shaft there, and that's going to have to come out through the bottom of the planer. Here's another look at that transmission shaft. It connects up through the hand wheel bracket, the height adjustment wheel bracket at the top, and to a little plastic sprocket underneath the planer base. All right, so to get at that sprocket, the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to remove the bicycle chain here on the bottom. But before I remove it, I'm going to put these index marks on each one of these little plastic sprockets and a corresponding mark on the bottom of the base here, so that because each one of these corner sprockets is attached to the elevation screws at the four corners of the planer. You've got to have those exactly right, or else you're not going to have a parallel cutter head carriage, and the thing is going to jam up when you try to raise and lower it. So the two middle ones here are just the tensioner sprockets, so they are not as critical, but the four corner ones are definitely critical. So I put a little just a little index mark with a Sharpie on each one of those, and then I'm going to loosen the and you can see the index marks there, and then I'll loosen the tensioner sprockets and remove the chain that way. Again, the tension sprockets don't matter; they can turn freely. It doesn't; they don't affect anything. But as I remove the chain, I'm going to be very careful not to move the sprockets. Now, truth is, over the course of this this process, this replacing the cutter head, those elevation screws are going to turn anyway, but you've got the index marks there, so you'll be able to get back to it pretty easily at the end. So once you've got the bicycle chain, the big chain off, you've got another smaller chain that connects to the sprocket that goes up to that transmission rod, and that's the next thing that you've got to remove. You can see here I put a second Allen wrench up in the top sprocket, that elevation sprocket, to hold it still, because otherwise when you try to turn the screw on this the smaller the other sprocket holding the smaller chain, the whole thing wants to turn. So I used a an Allen wrench just to hold that that corner sprocket, that elevation screw in place so that it wouldn't turn while I was trying to do this. Then you can take out the screw that holds in that that sprocket at the end of the transmission rod. Get the chain off. Once that sprocket is loose, you can remove that chain and then pull that whole rod out through the bottom. All right, once you have that sprocket out of the way, and you could actually remove the sprocket and the little chain there off of the other sprocket at this point. But then you've got a little bearing retainer that's held in with two screws. You've got to take out those two screws. Be careful not to lose the bearing that's on at the end of the transmission rod. And then once you've got that retainer out of the way, you can start working the transmission rod down through the base of the planer. All right, now you've got that little cap screw. If you haven't already removed it, there's a cap and a screw at the top of the transmission rod, which is to keep the carriage from going past the top of the transmission rod when you're raising the elevation. Once you take off that little cap at the top, at this point you can look up through the bottom of that elevation wheel handle bracket, and you can see the little pinion gears there, which is how the transmission rod gets turned in order to turn that sprocket and raise and lower the carriage. If you didn't already do it, you can now remove this little chain. Just be careful. Try not to turn that sprocket with the index mark. If you do, turn it back. But again, it's going to shift a little bit while you're doing this work. Just make sure you keep them as still as you can. Okay, now you can do this step. This could have been done at any point really, but this is the repeat-a-cut pin, and it's just held in. It's threaded into the bottom of the wheel bracket, and then it's got a lock nut on it. So just loosen the lock nut, and then it should just screw right out of the bottom of that wheel bracket. All right, now we want to loosen the nut at the end of the cutter head, which holds that pulley on. Keep in mind that on the stock cutter head, it is reverse threaded. So it looks like I'm futilely trying to tighten the nut here. I'm actually trying to loosen it because it is reverse threaded. But I'm trying to do it against the cutter head lock, trusting that little red cutter head lock to hold the cutter head still while I pull with a lot of force against this nut. And that's a bad idea because you're just going to end up breaking the cutter head lock mechanism off. Not a huge deal because you don't use it with a helical head. It doesn't have a cutter head lock function, but still kind of annoying. So this is the right way to do it. Instead of breaking off your cutter head lock mechanism, just get that little scrap of hardwood that you have lying around, about the length of your cutter head and about 3/8 of an inch thick, and wedge it in there. Then once you have that wedged in place, this is the nut that you're trying to get off. Remember that it's reverse threaded and it's going to be on there tight. So tight, in fact, that I needed some extra leverage to get it off. So I grabbed a pipe, and because this is a woodworking shop, it happened to be a pipe clamp, and I didn't bother to take off the pipe clamp parts. I just slid the pipe onto the end of the wrench, and that gave me the leverage that I needed. You can see the little board wedged into the cutter head to keep it from turning, and the augmented wrench on the nut there to break it free. It was really easy once I put that pipe on the end there. It took about a second just to give it just that much of a twist to break it loose. And once I broke it loose, I was able to put the pipe away, put the wrench back on the end there, get that nut off in pretty quick fashion. And once again, the the stock cutter head is reverse threaded on the end here, but keep in mind that when you put the Shelix head in, it is not reverse threaded. It's going to be standard right hand thread. So that's one difference between the two parts. The next step is to remove the belt, the drive belt. And there is a little tensioner screw right there between the two pulleys. So loosen that tensioner screw, but to be honest, you can't really take off, even with that screw, you can't take off a whole lot of tension. It's still really hard to get this belt off. I tried to use a little scratch awl there to kind of pry it off to the side. That did not work very well. Took me a while to just work this thing off. Really what you have to do, the best method that I could find to do it is just to kind of turn the pulley and walk the belt one groove at a time off the edge of the pulley. Keep doing that for a little while, be persistent, and at some point eventually it's finally going to pop off. But it's a bit of a challenge, and then you'll find when it's time to put it back on, you just have to do the same thing in reverse, and it continues to be difficult. At this point, I decided that it would be easiest if I flipped the planer upside down to get at the pulley and get a puller in there to remove that pulley from the end. So before I flipped it upside down, I decided I'd put a couple of screws in, or at least one screw in each corner, and put the top back on, just so that it has that rigidity when I flip the thing over. So you'll recall that I mentioned that ball bearing at the bottom of the repeat-a-cut mechanism earlier. That's that little stair-step case down at the bottom there. And if you haven't already lost that ball bearing, this is probably the point where it's going to fall out. So the next thing is to pull off the pulley. And I have a 3-jaw puller that I tried to use here, but that pulley is really tight up against the carriage, and I couldn't get the jaws, they're too thick, so I couldn't get the jaws in behind the pulley. So I grabbed a couple of these little cat's paw nail pullers that I had in my toolbox. I thought I could just pry the pulley out just enough to get that puller back in, but actually this ended up working so well that I was able to just get the pulley completely removed, and it slides right off. So I didn't need the puller after all. So if you don't have the right kind of puller, then improvise. Once you get the pulley off, there's a little key there, and you want to make sure to set that someplace secure, like in your little magnetic bowl like I used. Don't lose that thing. The helical head does not come with one. You're going to need to reuse that key when you put in the helical head and put the pulley back on. Now after getting that pulley off, this is when things started to get ugly for me. You can see again the elevation wheel bracket down there at the bottom. I did not want to take that off. It's got those little pinion gears in there, and I was kind of concerned about either losing them or not getting them to mesh properly if I took it off. So I was trying to just pull out the cutter head without having to remove that. And unfortunately, those screws that hold that retaining cap at the end of the cutter head, or the bearing retainer, those things are really in there. So I tried all kinds of creative ways to get those screws out, and really did more damage than anything else to the little sockets on those Allen screws. I just couldn't get them out. I didn't have the right Allen wrenches for it. So that was a challenge, and I finally decided after partially stripping those screws that I needed a better set of Allen wrenches, so that's what's going to happen next. But before I gave up, I was able to get 2 of the 3 screws in that bearing retainer out, which enabled me to remove this apparently, in my opinion, totally unnecessary little plate from the bottom of the bearing retainer. That little plate is, I have no idea what the purpose is. I do know that I'm going to forget to reinstall it when I do the reassembly a little bit later. So having tried everything I could think of, to include cleaning out the sockets on these little Allen screws with a tiny screwdriver and with a scratch awl, trying all kinds, every kind of tool that I had at hand, to try to get that final screw out from the bearing retainer. Nothing worked, and so I ended up finally ordering a good set of Allen wrenches. Of course, quality tools are not typically the ones that are delivered overnight, so I waited and I waited and I waited for the 2-week lead time to get the Allen wrenches delivered.
All right, pretty exciting moment now. I've been stuck for about 2 weeks because I can't get this screw right here, this last Allen screw out. I was starting to strip it, trying to use all the different tools that I have for the job here. Nothing was working, so I ordered a new better version of the Allen wrench from the interwebs. Again, it took 2 weeks for this to get here. It just arrived, so I'm pretty excited to open this up and see if this is the answer to all my problems. And if it is, I will recommend them for everyone. This is the Powerbuilt Xeon hex key set, and their claim is that they can remove a hex screw, an Allen screw, that's up to 85% stripped. So we'll see how it goes. All right, so the key to these keys, let me show you with the bigger one so you can see. The end of them has the very sharp edges to grab the screw, but it's also got the kind of the helical cut to it, which supposedly, as you turn it, is supposed to seat the wrench more deeply in the socket and enable it to come loose. So let's see what happens. And of course, the first step is to make sure that your socket, your Allen socket is clean. I'm getting nowhere. All right, I'll keep trying. I'll come back to this. Waited 2 weeks for a special tool that did not work. So next up, I'm gonna try to drill it out.
Well, I didn't want to do this, but the elevation wheel bracket is positioned so that I can't get a drill with a screw extractor past it to get to that bottom screw on the bearing retainer, so it had to come off. So I went ahead and pulled that off, and it's got those two beveled gears, the pinion gears inside of it, so just be careful. Of course, when you use the screw extractor, you destroy the screw, so we'll have to replace that. But it did finally come out. Here's a look at the those bevel gears. Just be really careful if you have to take this bracket off. Those gears are just in there loose. You want to make sure that you don't lose them or drop them or chip them or anything like that. So the technique that I used to pull the pulley off with these two cat's paws worked really well, so I thought I'd give it a shot again to get this bearing retainer off.
Okay, so I used two cat's paws, and I didn't turn on the camera because I actually didn't think this would work, but it did. Put the cat's paws under there, popped it, and the old cutter head popped right out. So there it is. That's the old cutter head that I'm removing and will replace with the helical head in just a minute.
All right, so this doesn't always happen, but in my case, pulling that retainer, the bearing retainer, pulled out the whole cutter head. So this was a good time to use that 3-jaw puller. I was able to use that to pretty easily pull the bearing retainer off, but the bearing was really wedged in there, and so it came off with the bearing retainer. Not a big deal. I just need to grab a dowel, just a slightly smaller diameter than the inside of that bearing retainer, and carefully tap out that bearing. Keep in mind, the bearing is trash. We're not going to reuse that. Hopefully you bought the cutter head that has the bearings pre-installed from Byrd Tool. You wouldn't want to reuse these bearings. If you're going through all this trouble, you definitely want to go ahead and put in new bearings at the same time. So that bearing is trash. Now we just clean up the bearing retainer, and then we'll seat that onto the bearing on the new cutter head. So a couple of things. You're just going to lightly tap this to get it firmly seated all the way around. Make sure that it's evenly positioned on the new bearing. You can see that I'm using just a block of wood with a 3/4 inch hole cut through it to protect the other end of the cutter head. You'll also notice here that I've removed all of the inserts, the carbide inserts, just to make things like this easier. I don't want to worry about cutting myself while I'm trying to put everything together here. So I removed those before I got started and set them all aside. So you do want to be careful of that other end, though. You want to make sure that the bearing retainer is seated properly, and then keep in mind that the other end has these mesh gears. It fits into the gearbox, so you want to protect those. All right, so this is a really good time before you put in the new cutter head to do some cleanup. You can look down into the gearbox there, check out the grease. In my case, the grease looked like it was fine, so I'm not going to take off the gearbox and repack it, but you could do that if you felt like you needed to. But looking down from the left side bearing housing down into that gearbox, there's just a lot of dirt here, a lot of stuff that might as well just clean it up while you've got everything apart. Now, before you start on the really getting into the cleanup, I recommend you put some tape over that bearing housing that covers or that leads into the gearbox, just so you don't get a bunch of gunk and dirt down into that grease. So after you get it all cleaned up, it should look nice, and then you're ready to remove that tape and drop the new cutter head in. So as you prepare to drop the cutter head in, just again keep in mind those the mesh gear at the end. Those can be a little bit fragile, so make sure that they seat properly and that you don't damage them tapping it into place. Just going to align everything. Of course, easiest to have the planer on its side when you do this. Get everything aligned. The bearings at the top and the bottom, or the bearing at the bottom and the bearing retainer at the top. And then just a couple of light taps to get everything kind of started. Get it seated initially. And then you're actually going to finish seating it by tightening the 3 screws on the bearing retainer. So after you've initially tapped it into place, the bearing that goes into the gearbox should look about like this. Make sure that you align the bearing retainer. The holes are not all centered the same way, so the one that's centered goes at the top, and then the other 2 should fall into place there. Get those screws in, go ahead and tighten those all the way down, and doing that will push the whole cutter head and the bearings into the right position. When you get done tightening those screws down, you'll know that you're there, because that bottom bearing, the bearing that goes into the gearbox, will now be flush with the housing. So you may recall that I said that I was going to forget the weird little half plate that goes in with the bearing retainer. I did. This is a picture of when I remembered it much later and installed it after the belt and everything was back on. But at this point, you should take out those 3 screws, put them back in with that half plate and with thread lock, and torque them down good and tight, and you're ready for the next step. Now, before you put on the pulley and the retaining nut, this is a good chance to give everything a quick test spin. Just make sure that everything is seated properly, that it spins freely. It should be really easy to turn. And then the next step that I did, I put a couple little pieces of tape on the feed rollers, and then spun the cutter head again to make sure that the gearing was connected properly down in that gearbox. As long as you can see both feed rollers turning, and the tape is just to help you see that they are turning, everything seems to be working well. The next step is to put the pulley on, and you can see that I had not yet remembered to put that little half plate back around the bearing retainer, so you make sure that's in place first, but then you put the little key in the slot and just slide the pulley back into position. After which, once the pulley's in position, you can put the retaining nut on, and this is where things got interesting because I suddenly noticed that the shaft for the new cutter head was not as long as the old one. There are no threads sticking past the retaining nut here. I had not thought to compare the two side by side, the old cutter head and the new one, before I installed it. So I pulled up, or I called Byrd Tools and got the dimensions of the one that they sell for the 13-inch planer. And you can see that the overall length is 15.635 inches. So I measured the old cutter head that I had taken out to see how that compared to the 15.6 inches. And in fact, the old one was about 16 1/4, so nearly right around 3/4 of an inch longer, which was a little bit concerning. But I went ahead and put some thread lock on the nut and put it in. I figure that nut is really just to hold the pulley in place, and it's the bearing retainer that really holds the cutter head in. So I think it'll be okay, but I am going to talk to Byrd Tool about it. Next up is putting the drive belt back on, and you can see that it was actually, I already had it on when I took that picture of the retaining nut with the thread lock. But you just work it back on the same way that you had worked it off. And then one quick note, I didn't show it, but I had taken off a little plastic cover that goes over the top pulley, and that is just held on with 3 Phillips screws. So just quickly put that back in, and then you've got everything essentially back in place, at least for the cutter head. And then we can go through the rest of the reassembly, which will actually be pretty quick. I decided to go ahead and clean up these bevel gears that go in that in the bracket that connects the elevation wheel to the transmission shaft. So I just used some simple green, cleaned them up, cleaned all the old grease off, made sure everything is ready to go. And then once that was done, I used a little wire brush and just some shop towels, got it all cleaned up. And then we'll put some all-purpose lube on the gears, get them all cleaned, lubed, and ready to go, and then reinstall. All right, this is it's called white lithium gear lube. I think any gear grease that you happen to have will work fine. Just make sure everything is well coated. You know, make sure that it turns freely. Put the other bevel gear in. Make sure that they both have a good dollop of that grease on there, and everything seems to be turning the way it should. And then just carefully, because there's nothing holding that bottom gear in place. So be a little bit careful when you turn it over and put it back onto the machine. So this is held in place with 5 screws. You just carefully put it back into position, and I started with the top screws to hold it in place, and then install and torque the rest of the screws. All right, next we'll put the top back on to get it ready to flip over. Again, I've got the top cage here marked with tape, so I know which side is the front. Not that it really matters, but I know that it lines up well this way, so this is the way I'm going to do it. This is my second time putting the top back on in order to flip it over, but this time we're getting close to the end, so I'm going to actually put in all 16 of these little Allen screws. And I'll just comment again that I think it's a little ridiculous that Ridgid thought they needed 16 Allen screws to hold the top in place here. And once you get all of these screws back in place and the top secured onto the frame, you can flip the whole thing over and get to work on the chains on the bottom of the machine. All right, with the planer upside down, we can put that transmission shaft back in, and this is actually a little bit tricky, trying to get it to line up again. You know, we had taken off that bracket with the bevel gears, and now you've got to get everything lined back up and get that groove to slide down in next to the tooth on the bevel gear. So I used a little screwdriver to kind of push that gear to the right position, and then just really carefully kind of messed with it until I could get that shaft to slide in next to the tooth that it needs to. Once you get the shaft in place, of course, you got to put the bearing and the two washers that go with the bearing back onto the end of it, up in the base there. And then, and don't forget to put that bearing retaining ring back on there as well. Once you've got that all put in, you put the small chain and sprocket back in using these little cap screws. I was showing that to you because keep in mind this is a different screw. This isn't like the little button screws that most of them are. This is still an Allen screw, but it's got a cap head on it instead of the button. That's how you can identify it. So get those into place, and then you're ready to put on the big bicycle chain. All right, very important now to check your index marks. Like I mentioned earlier, all of mine had moved, so go ahead and move them back into the right position so that everything is aligned properly when you put the chain on. Then it's time just to grab that chain, put it around the four corners and inside the tensioner sprockets. And again, just be super careful that your index marks stay aligned and that your sprockets don't turn while you're putting the chain on. It's the four corner sprockets that matter, not the tensioner sprockets. So just pay attention to those and make sure that it goes on all four of them kind of snug, and that the index marks are still aligned when you're done. All right, now you've got the chain in place and you've got the tension sprockets tightened back up again. You're going to do a quick test on it. Just put slide the elevation handle back on. You don't have to put the screw in, just put it onto the shaft and turn it. Make sure that all the sprockets are turning freely the way they should and everything appears to be operating properly. And it is. And now you're going to want to lube that chain, both chains really on the bottom. I chose to use a silicone lubricant here because of the plastic sprockets. I know WD-40 would probably work just fine, but silicone is made kind of to lubricate both metal and plastic, and I figured since there's some plastic parts under here, I didn't want to risk damaging them with any other kind of petroleum-based product. So both chains got a generous spray of silicone lubricant, and makes it turn noticeably quieter than it did before. All right, we flipped the planer back right side up now, and before we put the plastic pieces back on, we're going to do a quick parallel check. I've got two boards that I cut and measured very carefully beforehand. Make sure that they are exactly the same height, and just check to make sure that the rollers, the feed rollers, are hitting the boards at exactly the same time. So once you've got the parallel check done, and hopefully everything comes out well there, then you can start putting the sides back on, and we're definitely in the home stretch now. So start with this side, the right side of the planer as you're looking at it. It just sits in a little groove on the base there. Then you put the knob back on the repeat-a-cut lever there. Put the elevation wheel back on with the little center screw there. Screw that in, and then you can start putting the little sheet metal screws in through the corner brackets that go on the inside there. Get both sides put in, and raise and lower the carriage as needed to get to all four of those holes for the sheet metal screws. Remember, each side has two at the top and two in the middle. And likewise, remember that there are 4 totally unnecessary sheet metal screws in the plastic top for this planer. So have those ready, snap the plastic top back into place, and then you can install those 4 sheet metal screws and the 4 Allen screws that actually do hold the top to the frame of the planer.
All right, second to the last step, putting the indexer back on after you've got everything done and you moved it back, so because this thing will break if you move the planer around too much while it's installed. So now we're here. This is where the planer is going to live. So I'm going to go ahead and install my little plastic index thing. All right, planer is back together. And now the real last step, figuring out where to put the sticker. All right, before we do our test cuts, I want to make sure that everything is as clean and ready to go as possible. So a little bit of simple green, or whatever your tool cleaner of choice is. Spray some of that on there, but especially get the bed and the outfeed tables all nice and clean. Make sure there's nothing sticky, no residue, no nothing that's going to get on your board. Final step is a quick coat of wax. I like to use Johnson's paste wax. People have all kinds of different things. There's T9 Bow Shield, all kinds of stuff that you can use for this, but for me, Johnson's paste wax is cheap and effective, so I use it. So I'm going to use one paper towel, shop towel to spread the stuff on. And again, you want it on all the metal surfaces. Just kind of make sure it's evenly coated. And don't buff it yet. You're going to let it dry and then buff it off. Good uniform coat. Come back in about 10 minutes when it's all dry. Polish it off, buff it off to a nice shine, and then we'll be ready to put a board through. All right, the new Shelix head is installed, and I'm about to run the same 2 ash boards through the planer that I ran through with the straight knives as the first part of this project, just as a test. And so you can see here, I don't know if it's clear on the camera or not, but the first time I ran it through, I did 2 passes. Second pass is the one that I'm kind of counting. It was 113.2 decibels. I'll do a decibel check with my phone after I run this through, but I'm using the phone to film right now. But there's a good bit of snipe here at the end. Really only on one end, and I think that was the feed end. It was. So we'll see if that's cleared up, and we'll see how the finish comes out with the new cutter heads. So here we go. So, initial observations, really nice finish. No snipe at either end on that board. And again, and there was a noticeably different sound, and you could certainly hear the motor working as it went through. But no snipe on the outfeed, no snipe on the infeed. And it's a really smooth, nice finish. So yeah, I'm gonna call this a success. I am happy with the results. I'll do another quick pass using the phone for the sound check and see if it's any quieter. Like I said, it has a different tone for sure. I could sense that, I could hear that, but we'll see if it's any quieter. But again, that's really, that's not what this was about. This was about getting the best possible finish, and especially with figured woods. So, oh, the other thing, sawdust, it's a little lighter, but not noticeably different, to be honest with you. I don't know. Yeah, I guess it is lighter. These are actually curled up little shavings. So, yeah, it's that shear cut with those with the Shelix head is definitely making a difference. So, all right, well, there we go. Shelix cutter head in a Ridgid R4330 planer. It was a pain in the butt. I am not a huge fan of this planer, but it's mine now, and we'll make it work.
All right, so I did run the boards through a second time and used my phone with that NIOSH app again to check the decibel level, and as you can see, it dropped substantially. 113.2 the first time around, and then 98.2. So it is much quieter, which is nice. And again, a great finish. The Shelix cutter head is a great improvement, and I strongly recommend it for everyone. I hope this video was helpful, and good luck with your upgrades.